Welcome to the Pencil Bob channel. I hope you enjoy the story. Remember to like and subscribe. And now the story.
I live in a neighborhood that an HOA was formed in over a decade ago. I was essentially raised by my grandparents because my own parents really did not want me, and just wanted my little sister, whom they repeatedly said was the one they did not regret. I was born from an accidental teen pregnancy, and my parents showed very little love for me. So from the age of 10, my grandparents raised me, and they left me their house when they passed away. I never married. Just wasn't interested. But I am a bit of a paranoid man with keeping supplies stocked. When the virus hit, I already had a generous supply of soap, sanitizer, toilet paper, paper towels, disinfectant, bottled water, canned food, medical supplies, and even whiskey. Still keep all that well stocked. But it was from years of buying that stuff little by little. I also have a generator and a generous supply of filled propane tanks for heat and some insulated sleeping bags. I wish I had a wood stove too. But the house wasn't built with one. The HOA and I also did not get along. My grandparents turned down their invitation to join, and so did I when I inherited the house. Most of the time, the HOA left me alone. However, back then, the president would come to our door to say something whenever he had a bone to pick with us. It never got him far. And I did kind of find it amusing to see how my grandpa would send him packing. When the pandemic hit, word spread about my stash of supplies. I willingly shared some with my neighbors and friends. But certainly not with anyone on the HOA, as they've been a thorn in my family's side for years. When the HOA was formed, they demanded for months that my grandparents join. And they had the balls to try numerous underhanded tactics, all of which I documented in various ways. They thought they could pick on an elderly couple and say they were members whether they liked it or not. They stated rules that they completely made up and repeatedly threatened us, even saying they would come into the house to take away our guns because the HOA did not approve of any firearms. We checked their bylaws and there was nothing about guns on it. In fact, they were trying to force the same thing on some of the other residents, all of whom fought back. And that fake bylaw was soon dropped when there was talks of rebellion. But the HOA still didn't leave us alone. I convinced my grandparents to let me install CCTV so I could catch every further interaction of the HOA, showing up, demanding my grandparents join, and threatening them. This turned out to be a very good idea, as the HOA attempted to have all 3 vehicles towed from my grandparents' driveway. We confronted the tow truck driver that was attempting to take my grandpa's old wagon, and he said to take it up with the HOA, as they were authorized to tow from them. When we told them that our house was not a part of the HOA, the driver didn't care and took the car anyway. We called the police to get the car back. The police had to talk to the HOA, who were forced to admit being in the wrong as they were all sniveling cowards. The police then had some words with the tow company, and they brought the car back free of charge. The tow driver glared at us after he put the wagon back and he never returned. Well, that incident was the final nail in the coffin, and my grandpa started a lawsuit against the HOA for harassment, and when their lawyer saw my pile of evidence, he told them to just settle out of court. The HOA paid the court and lawyer fees, and my grandparents got a few grand on top of that. From then on, the HOA stayed far away from us. But there was obvious animosity. They even tried to get our neighbors to shun us, which did not work out. When I inherited the house from my grandparents, the HOA already knew me well and didn't really bother to try and pull the same stunts of harassment they had before with my grandparents. But they did try once to emphatically suggest I join. But I told them to kick rocks, and I'll leave them alone if they leave me alone. If not, they were free to answer to my 12-gauge and police, as I'm not the type of person to hesitate in defending myself or calling the cops if the HOA starts making trouble with me. I would also have no problem suing for harassment like my grandparents did. It was clear to them that leaving me alone for the moment was the better choice. So that was supposed to be the last time I had any trouble with them. At least until the incident a couple years later that I'm about to describe. As supplies became available again in late 2020, I replenished my stock. However, the 2021 January ice storm hit my area hard, and we were without power for over a week in the dead of winter. And I was the only person in the neighborhood properly prepared for it. I had some neighbors with generators, but many of them ran out of gas to generate power within a few days. My generator wasn't enough to power my whole house. Just key things like my fridge, freezer, microwave, and a few other necessities. I kept my house warm with propane. I had battery-powered lighting, plenty of books to read, portable DVD players, my laptop, and I had a large number of filled propane tanks in a variety of sizes at the ready to keep warm with. So I was okay. My neighbors, not so much though. No one could drive anywhere. It was about 15 degrees Fahrenheit outside, if not colder. There was debris everywhere from fallen trees. The ground was covered in a sheet of very slippery ice that was on top of snow. And there were many fallen trees, some of which completely blocked the roads. My next-door neighbors, who are friends of mine, were having a very hard time keeping warm. At the time, they had a baby who was only a few months old at the time, and they were not prepared for the outage at all. And there was one more family across the street, whose house had a tree fall on it. So I invited both families into my home. I also took in a retired elderly couple from a few houses down that were freezing because they had no form of heat. All those people stayed with me for the duration of the outage. I invited the first family over right after the power went out because I knew they were not prepared. And the family whose house was damaged by a tree I brought over while the storm was still going on in the middle of the night. When the tree landed on their house, it took out an entire section of it and exposed the inside of the house to the elements. The father of the family came to me in a panic, and I tied a rope to my porch, and we made our way to his damaged house to get his family back to mine. We used the rope to pull ourselves back to my house because of all the ice, darkness, and storming frozen winds. I managed to get the whole family over, and after the storm was over, they also brought what supplies they had, including more propane, another generator, and more gasoline they'd been storing. That all went pretty far for heating and powering my house. I had more than enough supplies for all of us, and collectively we had myriad of electronic devices to use, many of which were rechargeable. But I had a lot of batteries for those that weren't. And those were great at keeping kids entertained. They also had handheld gaming devices of their own. We were able to keep charged thanks to the generators. I wasn't used to living with other people since my grandparents died, but it felt good to help them out. Then there was the elderly couple down the street. I'll refer to as George and Gracie, that came to stay with me too. They were good friends of my grandparents. So I checked in on them and found they had no heat without electricity, and were sitting in a running car just to use the heater and that. George had just barely managed to chip off enough ice to get the car door open so they could sit in it. I brought them in, and they sort of became like the temporary grandparents of the house and helped look after the kids. The HOA, though, was somewhat aware of my supplies, and they could easily see my house was thriving during the outage. So they came over in a group to talk to me on the second day of the outage. They had some idea of having everyone in the HOA go stay in one building, and they wanted that building to be my house because I already had supplies and heat. I told them that I wasn't hosting their group in my home. I was already taking care of two families and an elderly couple not related to me, and that was enough. I got a lecture on being neighborly from them, but I just lectured them back that I had made my decision and to look for somewhere else to bundle up. And besides that, I clearly did not trust them for obvious reasons. And they were the last people in the neighborhood I'd let into my home, then shut my door in their faces. If I had hosted all of those entitled people and their families, my house would have been beyond crowded, and all of my supplies would have been taken from me. In situations like those, people will resort to taking and calling it sharing. I wasn't about to risk that. But I did still hand out water and sanitizer to neighbors that came by. The HOA wasn't done with me, though. On the third day of the outage, they crowded at my house with their families demanding to be allowed entry into my home. I told them I had no room, and to leave me alone. The HOA didn't take no for an answer, though, and tried to force their way in. But I am not a small man. I knocked their leader right down and off my porch, and told them that if they tried that again, I'd make sure to notify police later. I was then backed up by the other men I'd taken in, and they were armed. The HOA president yelled at me that they were all freezing and needed entry. But I was already hosting 10 people in my house and giving out supplies to neighbors.
I wasn't going to take on anymore.
Then I told the HOA to leave, or I'd be getting my shotgun. Well, after they left, the two dads, George and I, had a bit of a meeting and decided we needed to take turns keeping watch. I'll refer to the dads as Dad 1 and the other as Dad 2 in the order in which I invited them over.
And George is George, of course.
For an old man in his 70s, he had some strength and grit to him like a man 20 years younger. We all agreed there was no way those ashats of the HOA would take this all laying down.
At times like this, men will become animals to get what they want. So we started taking shifts guarding the house and supplies. I slept on my couch with my 12-gauge next to me.
And on that very night, I got woken up by Dad 2, who was currently on watch, yelling for me. I came running into the garage to find Dad 2 against the garage door and holding it shut.
He said there was people outside trying to force it open.
It was right about that moment we heard a very loud gunshot. It turned out to be George at my back door.
He'd grabbed his own shotgun that he brought from his house and fired it into the air outside when he caught two men in my backyard trying to get in through the door.
Dad 1 woke up and came running out to help, and we all ran into the backyard. We found my side gate had been forced open, the old latch had been broken. We made our way out front from there and saw roughly 10 people trying to run across the road with weapons in hand.
Like bats, claw hammers, and crowbars. And they were repeatedly slipping and falling on the ice that covered the road. All of them were the HOA members and people related to them, like their teenage sons or brothers.
We blinded them all with 1,000 lumen flashlights and rounded them up at the edge of the sidewalk. We had them all drop their weapons, and George mused, we should break a few of their fingers just to scare them a bit more.
They all begged us not to report them to police, and I said to never come back, or the next time somebody might get shot.
They skittered off like frightened children trying to run across an ice rink.
We did a makeshift repair on my gate to keep it closed, and the rest of the week all 4 of us spent nights on guard. We played lots of cards and games, drank whiskey, and did regular patrols around the house. No one from the HOA came back to bother us.
There was an occasional knock for help from someone needing something, though.
The neighbors were really needing water, and I was running out of it. So I'd taken to melting ice in pots and boiling it with an electric hot plate, then filling jugs. That gave several of my neighbors clean drinking water. The rest of the outage was otherwise uneventful until the thaw kicked in and more stuff started falling as the ice broke apart.
When the ice and snow had all cleared up, the widespread damage was pretty evident.
It took the county months to clean up all the debris. We found out later that the other neighbors had followed our example and basically banded together 3 or so families per home to try and stay warm and share supplies. Pretty much the whole of the HOA wasn't welcome to join in since they were hated by pretty much everyone by that point. So they all had to band together in the one house they owned that had a wood-burning stove.
And they burned pretty much anything they could get their hands on.
Some of which they took from neighbors. There was evidence of repeated thefts and vandalism all over the neighborhood.
And the key suspects were the HOA and their families.
But none of the neighbors could prove it was them. My CCTV was off due to the power being out.
But we made sure all our neighbors knew we'd caught the HOA trying to break into my house. After the power was finally back on, there was a lot of work to do.
Like Dad 2, making an insurance claim to fix his house. Dad 2's family actually ended up staying with me for a while longer before the home repairs could really get started. George and Gracie's old house suffered a few broken pipes due to the freezing cold. But George is a retired plumber.
So he handled it.
A large limb had fallen on Dad 1's car and did enough damage that it was later considered totaled.
I didn't really have any time to help any of them out, much as I had to go back to work a couple days after the power was back on, and I was kept very busy for a while. Being sick of the HOA, the bulk of the neighborhood filed in February to have an emergency HOA meeting. And in said meeting, they wanted the entire board to resign. They refused to step down, and the residents had to get lawyers involved.
It did go to court, and the HOA itself was found to be violating the law several ways and embezzling funds. The entire HOA was shut down pending a full investigation. At first, it was just temporarily shut down, and then it became permanent.
All of the former board members have left the neighborhood, and I ended up making some great friends with Dad 1 and Dad 2.
And we're regular backyard drinking buddies.
I pay a visit to George and Gracie now and then too. They've all taken to keeping supplies like I have as well.
Just in case this sort of thing ever happens again.
I would like to thank you for watching the video to the end. To encourage us to make more videos, please like, subscribe, comment, as well as share. Check out this other video if you haven't already.